Welcome to our presentation on Indigenous peoples and the hegemony of Anglo culture. We will first look at Jane Griffith's paper Off to School, Filmic False Equivalence and Indian Residential School Scholarship. In her paper, Griffith explores how two National Film Board of Canada documentaries, Off to School, produced in 1958, and Christmas at Moose Factory, produced in 1971, depict Indian residential schools. She also examines the change in residential school scholarship over the last 50 years. She notes that Off to School presents three different vignettes grouped into a single narrative, and that these three vignettes are equated along superficial lines of education and distance, creating a false equivalence. She states that residential schools represented colonial tactics and perpetuated settler colonial goals through approaches that separated children from their languages, parents, extended families, communities, political structures, spiritualities, and ceremonies. She points out that the first two vignettes depict the benefits of settler colonialism for settlers. However, the third one, focused on the residential school, denies the violence of settler colonialism directed at Indigenous children. She notes that the residential school in Off to School is identified with fingers on a map, that the Indigenous children are identified as orphans coming from broken homes or from isolated communities where there are no schools. Their names are mocked. Their parents are presented as non existent or neglectful, and the state is presented as coming to the rescue, offering a solution to a problem that has no name. Griffith states that unlike Off to School, Christmas at Moose Factory by Abenaki filmmaker Alanis Obamsawin focuses on Indigenous children as individuals. They are the ones who narrate stories of home life and speak warmly of their parents. The Cree language is presented in both words and song. The children's photographs are shown and their names are listed. She states that this film reveals a way in which children's voices were pushing against narratives about themselves, their parents, and their land. Why such different representations? She notes that there were changes to residential schools in the period between the two films. In 1948, 60% of school-aged Indigenous children went to a residential school. In 1969, the government's co-running of residential schools was replaced by contracts with provinces, which resulted in 60% of school-age Indigenous children being taught in integrated provincial schools. Also, she notes that there were changes in the way children were portrayed on screen, especially by the National Film Board. And she mentions that there were reform efforts during this period. The first one she notes is the Caldwell Report of 1967 on residential schools in Saskatchewan, which recommended that the federal government invest more in family support services, keep Indigenous children with their families and in their communities. The recommendations were ignored by the government. The second reform she mentions is the National Indian Brotherhood Indian Control of Education Report of 1972, which expressed the need of parental control over education, culturally relevant curriculum, support for Indigenous teachers, and improved facilities. In her overview of the changes in residential school scholarship over the last 50 years, Griffith starts out with a look at archival studies and notes the text written by Malloy, Miller, Titley, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Committee report. She states that these present a historical view of policies, commissions, administrators, and laws that were responsible for and shaped residential schools. She then looks at qualitative research, noting the works of Celia Haig Brown, Elizabeth Furness, and Agnes Jack, stating that these texts focus on memories of former students from one school or stories of survival and resistance, and that the interviews reveal both the overlapping and individual experiences of students at the school and after. She notes that this research also reveals the ability of students to not only survive but also resist the assimilationist goals of the school. In her examination of the new directions that residential school scholarship has taken, Griffith first looks at geographical analysis, which draws comparison between Indian residential schools in Canada and the US, or looks at Indigenous children who attended schools in both countries, or focuses on Indian day schools which incorporated assimilative educational goals. She then looks at Indigenous autobiography, explaining that these texts are published memoirs of residential school survivors, stating that their detailed testimonies contextualizes what life was like before, during, and after time spent in residential schools. She states that recent scholarship insists on the importance of being instructed on how to bear witness when listening to testimonies, so as not to appropriate, consume voyeuristically, or be passive listeners to survivors' experiences. She also mentions inquiries focused on the role of literature and memoir in the learning and teaching about residential schooling. And she notes recent research on the Truth and Reconciliation Committee report, some of which has been critical at the lack of responsibility placed on non-Indigenous Canadians. Griffith also explores new theoretical understandings of residential schooling and mentions settler colonialism, penned by Patrick Wolfe, who states that this is not an event, but an ongoing structure. It depends on land and it denies the violence that has been committed. She states that this type of analysis has influenced recent studies on residential school history, highlighting education as a colonial strategy for acquiring land. She also notes the limitations of settler colonialism analysis and its potential to replicate colonial methods of domination. She, however, finds Andrew Wolford's concept of settler colonialism useful. He explains that there are three layers of nets that consist of number one, institutions, number two, state-sponsored agencies, and number three, parents, children, teachers, principals, and communities. In order to understand any specific residential school experience, he states that we have to look at all three levels. Griffith concludes her paper by stating that recent scholarship and films about residential schools present us with new questions for considering colonial histories and present-day realities. She asks, what are the implications for new understandings of the past in shaping the future of education? Moreover, how can aesthetic action, image, sound, movement, how can they guard against false equivalence, enable resistance to present-day settler colonialism? Her future is one in which public discourse and scholarship will recognize residential schooling as one colonial tactic among many, from ongoing land dispossession to the prison industrial complex and environmental racism. We will now watch a short video on how Canada is currently progressing with implementing Indigenous education in the school system.
If we do this education work now, if we start really having these honest conversations, we have the potential to realize something that we've never seen before in this country.
Hope across the country thanks to progress on Indigenous education. A new report released today shows provinces and territories are largely moving forward in education for reconciliation. Of course, there's still a long way to go.
And until we rectify the great imbalances in the presentation of history, in how we teach our students in this country, and how we share information with them, we will remain at peril as a nation because we need the truth.
Kairos, the organization that created the report, examined each province and territory. They looked at how each implemented mandatory curriculum on Indigenous people and history. They say there's still an underrepresentation of Métis, Inuit, and First Nations experience in different programs, a lack of Indigenous teachers and administrators overall, and poor training for staff.
The curriculum is not really any good unless there's somebody who is working with that curriculum. And then there's, on the other hand, that there is more work to be done. There's a lot of people who don't have the knowledge or the experience to be able to teach curriculums that are there.
But Manitoba is leading the way as the only province to score excellent in both public commitment and implementation. That's due to its consultation with Indigenous people and for including key topics like residential schools in social studies classes from grades 1 to 11. A former Indigenous education liaison saw less racism and fights when Indigenous education was introduced. He also saw the academic achievement of Indigenous students increase.
They started to be able to see who they are within that and become prouder of that fact. And because they were learning more of their tradition, and their tradition gave them a grounding.
Quebec, meanwhile, has significant work to do to achieve this.
And in Quebec, part of the reason that it hasn't improved is because they aren't working effectively with Indigenous communities directly. So it means that what they have done, they've done it is riddled with inaccuracies and bias.
Ontario received both an excellent and good score, but the director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation is very concerned about the future. This summer, the province cancelled work that would have incorporated Indigenous content into the curriculum, even though it has since said it will go through with plans to add this kind of content.
The rollback is concerning for two reasons. One, it shows the status of leadership, and two, it shows or it affirms that kids in those systems may be denied their right to receive a proper and truthful and honest accounting of who we actually are.
Now, Alberta earned an excellent score in public commitment, but maintained a good rating for actually implementing it. Meanwhile, BC stayed at good for public commitment and improved from needs improvement to good in implementation. In Winnipeg, Stephanie Lasuc, City News.
In this next article, we will be discussing Herbert Northcott's article, Going Native, A White Guy's Experience Teaching in an Aboriginal Context. In this article, Northcott presents his own experience teaching Indigenous students in a post-secondary institution. He observes that the majority of First Nations students pursuing post-secondary studies are mature students. After teaching the course the way he would normally teach, through lectures and multiple-choice exams, he observed that the Aboriginal students did not do as well as other students studying at the university. This led him to believe that there was a discrepancy between Euro-Canadian and Aboriginal models of teaching and learning. After all, he was a white guy using white textbooks and a white pedagogy. On the first day of a new course on inequality and social satisfaction, the students pointed out the traditional layout of the classroom placed the facilitator in a superior role when compared to the students. Northcott noted that in Aboriginal culture, communication often took place in a circle where all were considered to be more or less equal. Northcott decided to ground the curriculum in students' own culture and experience, using more of a native-centered pedagogy, where he would facilitate discussion that emphasized oral communication and student experiences. He would attempt to be as non-obstructive as possible and also sit in the circle with his students. After doing this, he found that his presence in the circle still had him in a superior role, as the students felt he could still control who spoke and for how long. It appeared to the students that there was less equality amongst the group when he was there, so he decided to remove himself and allow the group to facilitate themselves. However, given the cultural differences between Euro-Canadian and Aboriginal culture, there was a resistance to critical discussion, as the culture emphasizes equality, while in Northcott's experience, Euro-Canadian culture focuses on inequality. He was also an outsider to the culture, which meant that those within the community would not speak poorly of their culture in front of him. Making comments inside the class could have ramifications for how they are viewed in the small community, and discussing inequality or their dissatisfaction with nepotism that occurs within the community would be passed on later to others. While he tried as best he could to remove himself from being the figurehead, he was still the white outsider, grading them, facilitating their discussions, and overall in charge of the class. Northcott found that students were not partial to the typical discussions to provoke critical thinking because of their cultural or of non-interference, where they should not tell people what to do. He did find that there was evidence of critical thinking in their writing. He also found that the students gradually improved as the course progressed, which was not predominantly seen when using the Euro-Canadian lecture and multiple-choice question method for instructing the course. His attempt to use student experience and remove the more traditional pedagogy was certainly a challenge and may not have gone well if there were students that lacked experience or knowledge of the subject matter. Both he and the students felt that augmenting the course with Aboriginal text on the subject could help support everyone. We can see from Northcott's article that having culturally appropriate material and facilitators would help students to relate to the content and would support their learning. It would create a more open learning environment, allowing students to feel more open to discussion, growth, and success.
So moving on to the third article by John Paul Rastool, I decided to focus on his article supporting successful transitions to post-secondary education for Indigenous students. I found this article quite interesting, to be honest, and I really admire the work he's doing around bringing Indigenous perspectives to education and making sure that they are at the forefront of mainstream practices and pedagogy, for that matter. Just to start, I want to just say that I'm aware of the fact that there are so many stigmas out there relating to Indigenous people, their education, their way of life. But I really like the fact that John Paul brings light to some of the statistics, positive statistics that were found. And I find them really interesting. The article mentions the fact that 70% of Indigenous students between the ages of 16 and 24 hope to complete some form of post-secondary education. And 80% of the parents support their children and want them to complete some form of post-secondary education. So I thought that was really positive. With that being said, the article discusses some of the ways that the institutional policies and practices can either support or hinder the success transitions to post-secondary education for Indigenous youth and people in general. Some of the barriers that were discussed in this article were things like finances. So many of us have the privilege of being able to pay for our education, and some don't. And in these cases, these students don't feel like they have the financial resources to be able to go to post-secondary education, to move forward that way. And most of them don't even know what resources are out there that could financially help them. Another point that I found really interesting was the absence of role models. We all know how important it is for us to be able to see our cultures and who we are in the educational system. And we also know that things like this can be great motivators. And many Indigenous students don't feel like they're being represented as a culture or as a community. And this is a huge factor, and I believe that this contributes to either great motivation in wanting to change that, or a lack of motivation, feeling like they may not be able to achieve it. Another point that was expressed was the fact that the Indigenous students don't believe in the Canadian structure when it comes to education. They don't trust it. They don't trust the Canadian educational system due to historically ethnocentric practices and residential schools, which is understandable. It's important to understand and be aware of the oppressive systems that have been put in place and understand that they've affected Indigenous people for decades. So it's understandable why they're so reluctant to trust it. A lack of support in high school was one that really struck a chord with me. It's a huge barrier because the students expressed that they didn't feel support from their teachers, and said that most of the teachers they felt would think that they would fail. So the teachers didn't have faith in them that they would achieve anything greater than a high school education. Some of the recommendations, the youth recommendations for post-secondary education practices, are things like academic support and guidance, a list of scholarships and resources, which is huge. They need to know where to go to find these things. Indigenous youth speakers, seeing their culture as a voice, posters and resources that represent them, their people, a culture, their community. It's so important. They felt like they needed more information, and that's one of the things they can put in place, making sure that there's enough information relating to Indigenous youth and their community supports. We talk about culturally responsive pedagogy and understanding the importance of students being able to see themselves in their cultures and making sure that they're feeling represented in the classroom. And Indigenous students need to be able to see themselves represented through posters, the curriculum, resources, simple things like going back to elementary school, seeing themselves in the toys, the language that's being used in the classroom. Not just represented, but represented positively. Lastly, there's a clear gap between the educational achievements of Indigenous people in Canada, and I just felt like this quote was so fitting. We can try so hard to put these things in place for post-secondary education, but the truth of the matter is that these supports need to be put in place from the time these students walk into primary school, and this support should follow them throughout their whole educational career. There's a little video by Jean-Paul Rastoul that I found really interesting. And if you just want to see a little bit about the work that he's doing in these communities and the research and the advocacy, you can look at that video. It's really interesting. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and we hope you enjoyed it.